Part two of today's show is going to talk about the Notre Dame team. And we have a lot of fun topics to kind of get into and a lot of detailed topics to get into, Shaun. But what we wanted to do today, and we were going to do this for Notre Dame and then the rest of college football, but because of the House settlement, we're going to talk about that in this college football section. We'll move this one back to another day. But we wanted to talk about sort of floor versus ceiling for Notre Dame. We've talked a lot about that. We're going to talk about that with each of the 12 opponents that we do. We did a floor versus ceiling discussion with Miami when we previewed Miami on Thursday. We'll do one tomorrow when Trevor and I preview Texas A&M. You and I wanted to do one with Notre Dame. And so what we're going to do, Shaun, is we're going to kind of talk about our floor versus ceiling performance expectations for the offense, the defense, and the team. And when we talk about floor, it's not so much like what's the worst they could possibly do, because anything can happen. I mean, anything can happen. A team could go 4-8. I mean, the floor for Florida State going into the season wasn't 2-10. That's what happened. The floor is sort of a reasonable expectation of what a team could do at the very minimum. Beyond that is disappointment. Like, you did a poor job. If this is your record, you underachieved. It's meant to give you sort of a range of what's a good performance from just, okay, you met the minimum standard to you maximized your potential. The floor for anyone is 0-12. I mean, realistically, but that would be a ridiculous conversation to have. So that's what we're going to dive into today for the team. And then, of course, the performance of the offense and defense. And let's start off with the offense, Shaun, because this is the side of the ball that is still sort of the bigger question for Notre Dame. And I think there's a lot of talent. There's a lot of expectations, but it's sort of but what if? We got to see the line play together. We don't know about the quarterback, who it's going to be, what that performance is going to be like. We're still, two new receivers as part of the rotation. Can Greathouse and Faison carry their postseason performance into the regular season? There's a whole lot of things to kind of go there when you look at the offense. But we're going to talk big picture about the offense and begin sort of looking at what our expectations are, floor versus ceiling for the offense. And we'll kind of get into some different aspects of it, Shaun. But I'm going to let you kind of kick things off as far as what you think the floor is for the Notre Dame offense, and then what you think the ceiling is, and everything in between. So let's kick that off with you.
I'll say the floor is what we saw offensively last year for the offense. They able to put up points specifically against the teams that they're just more talented than. But when you get into the big games, it's an offensive struggle. And we really don't see growth in the passing game that we expect to take place with the quarterbacks. Even though they're young and it'll be their first time starting, we expect the passing game to take a step forward with the inclusion of Will Pauling and some of the other transfers that are coming into the wide receiver room. All right. So that's just 1 + 1 is 2 offensively. We also expect the running game with an offensive line that we expect to be better with the talent that's returning. You have guys that were first-time starters last year. That was the issue, an experience issue last year in the offensive line. You got guys coming back from injury. You have guys improving because they have game experience, getting a full season under their belt at the tackles position in particular. You expect that offensive line to be more cohesive, especially to start the season, and to be more powerful. And they had a really good running game last year without that. So now we expect the running game to be even more explosive. We expect yards per rush to possibly go up. If it's incrementally, or does it take a big number? Let's say incrementally would be what? 0.2 to 0.4 yards per carry, 2/10 to 4/10.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just go
in
that
range.
I'll
Anything above that, it's fair to say would be like, yo, that's a pretty good jump.
Yeah, I mean, because they ranked 7th in the country last year at 5.7.
Right.
And if they go up 0.3, they're 4th, and they're right behind, and they're behind New Mexico, Boise, and Kansas State. Meaning, if they just go up 0.3, actually, if they only go up 0.2, Shaun, that puts them number 2 in the nation behind Power 5 teams. Because if you look at their numbers last year, they were 7th last year, but they were 4th amongst Power 5 teams. So still,
would you say good. If they did the same thing against a tougher schedule, would you be more impressed?
Yeah, I mean, I think the run defense schedule last year was actually better than the one that
Okay.
we faced this year. I mean, you had, and I actually did an article on that, but it's the thing we don't think about that, Shaun, is because some of the better teams they played were not your typical really good teams. Like Army had an elite run defense, but that number also includes playing against Indiana, Ohio
It
State,
was
Georgia, and
inflated.
Penn State in the postseason.
Yeah,
Four
true.
teams that ranked first, third, ninth, and where was Georgia? They were in the 30s, I believe, 36 in rush defense last season. And those four teams ranked second, third, seventh, and 31st in yards allowed per carry last season. So, like, they were elite. They played elite rush defenses in the postseason. You look at the regular season, they were even better in the regular season, and I think that's the thing that you've got to go show is that you can do. It's great to do that at the end of the season, but they didn't run the ball very well in the postseason. They were at 6.3 going into the postseason. They dropped down to 5.66 after 4 games in the postseason.
Yeah,
part of that's Jeremiah Love being injured.
right.
Part of that's Rocco Spindler got hurt in the first game. I mean, there's a lot of that to it, but and part of it was they couldn't throw the football, and so the teams in the postseason were good enough to say we're going to make you beat. We're not going to let you run the football on us.
Yeah.
And if Jeremiah Love doesn't rip off a 98-yarder in the first game, it's even more problematic.
Yeah.
Their offense was able to kind of do it. But yes, to your point, Shaun, I do think it's fair to say a minimum 0.3 adjustment shows growth, like legitimate growth. But they were still even outstanding last year. But to your point, but can you do it for an entire season where you're not just doing it against Florida State and the really good run defense of Army, had a great run defense, but you're going to overwhelm them with talent in a way you're not going to do to Penn State. You're not going to do to Georgia and that type of thing. There aren't a lot of great run defenses on paper on their schedule in 2025, less than there even was last year. But when you get to the postseason, which ultimately, Shaun, is what we're talking about, that's when you find out, like, okay, now how much better are you really? That's a much bigger question mark.
And I think the floor, like I said, things being very similar to last year, having to depend on the run game, really not having a downfield passing game that we actually saw in spots against Penn State, against Ohio State. You want that to be more consistent. You expect it to be more consistent. But if it looks more like the offense of last year, which I'm sure would, be a disappointment in Mike Denbrock, that for me is the floor, because I think Notre Dame still will be able to win games and have a successful season if that's the case. It's not what Notre Dame fans want. It's not what Notre Dame wants. But that would be the floor for me offensively. A lot of expectation around Notre Dame possibly having a 1,000-yard receiver. I'm not sitting here saying I would be disappointed if they don't, because it's the nuance of it. Okay, no one reached 1,000,
right?
But do you have 2 guys over 750?
Right.
Like, what is the composition of that not taking place? So that, for me, just to put it simply and to let you rock in on it, I think if the offense is similar to last year, but yet still effective, and Notre Dame can still push teams around and be more physical than teams, for me, that would be the floor.
Yeah. When I look at this team, Shaun, I think the floor for me is repeating what you did last year, running the football and being moderately more effective throwing the football. What's interesting is when you look at the offense last year, they were actually pretty efficient throwing the football. They completed a high percentage of their passes. They didn't have and they had some drops at times, but in the postseason, the drops weren't the issue. They only had like 2 fumbles all year. I think you had the Jaden Thomas had one against USC, and then you had the one Bo Collins against Stanford. Riley didn't have a lot of turnovers in the pass game. He had 8 picks in 16 games. I don't believe Riley lost a fumble in the pass game. His only lost fumble was against Miami of Ohio. That was on a scramble. So, they were pretty efficient. What they lacked was explosiveness. And that's what hurt them. I mean, high completion percentage because they didn't throw a lot of balls beyond 10 yards. So that's going to help your completion percentage. So if the offense just does what it did last year running the football, but the offense, the pass game becomes just 15, 20% better, that makes the offense a lot more effective. And that should be the floor. The floor should be that you're 10 to 15% better in the pass game and you're able to at least repeat what you did in the run game in the regular season. And then I think the run game then becomes more effective if it's no better from an execution standpoint, no better from an efficiency standpoint, everything exactly the same as far as effectiveness, but your pass game is 10 to 15% better. This offense gets a lot better because now there's more openings in the run game because you have to give more respect to the pass game. But it's a minimal improvement. It's not a giant improvement. And what we saw from last year's offense was what, Shaun? We saw an offense that is, like you said, dynamic against the worst teams in the schedule, but struggled with consistency against the better teams. But the difference was between this offense and past offenses, Shaun, is this one did enough in some of those big games where the last ones would just be 3 points, 7 points, 14 points. This offense was more effective. You scored 27 points against Indiana, scored 27 points against Penn State, even scored 23 against Ohio State. There's times in the past where 23 points in some of these big games get you a W. I mean, the last time you played Ohio State, 23 points would have got you a W. It just, your defense didn't play its best either. So I think that's the floor. The ceiling to me is this is a top 5 national offense in every measurable category. Points per game, yards per game, yards per play, efficiency numbers, all of it. And the thing is that's people. I've had this conversation. People kind of like, there's this assumption that the Notre Dame offense was just kind of mediocre last year. I think that's a very misguided viewpoint of what this offense was last year. This offense was pretty good last year. It just needs to be better. And that's not my opinion, Shaun. This is something that every metric that you're going to look at is going to tell you the same exact story. If you look at the Fermo efficiency index last year and where they rank Notre Dame's offense, and that takes into things, who you played against, it takes out garbage numbers. So if you're in like the last 2-3 touchdowns against Purdue don't factor into this really. They don't look at those type of things. You look at the football power index for Notre Dame last year and you look at their efficiencies and their numbers last year. I'm actually going to pull those up, which I think overall the football power index is pretty bad and pretty biased against Notre Dame, but they ranked 9th last year in efficiency on offense. And then when you look at the Fermo efficiency index last year, I think they were 7th. I'm trying to pull that up, but the website's not really working great right now, but they were top 10 for sure on offense. So this was a top 10 offense last year, which is why they played for a championship. It ranked 9th last year. So the offense ranked 9th in efficiency in the FPI and the FEI. If 9th is good enough to get you to the title game. I think you can be better though. And I think a top 5 offense to me this year is the ceiling. I don't care about number 1. I'm just saying, if you're and what does that mean? What does a top 5 offense mean? Well, a top 5 offense, in my opinion, is one, and this is end of the season, not end of the regular season, because end of the regular season, they were over 30 points a game. I'm talking end of the season, meaning you've played multiple playoff games. You're about 38 plus points per game, which a year ago would have ranked them 4th in the country. We're talking about an offense that's at least 460 to 470 yards, which, last year ranks you in the top 10 to 5 in total offense, although I don't care as much about total yards as I do about yards per play. That's the number that I care more about. Last year, Notre Dame ranked 27th in yards per play at 6.3. I want to see them at least top 5 to 10, which means you're around 6.5 to about 6.9 yards per play. That's what I want to see them at next year. And I think they're capable of it with an offense that keeps its efficiency, but becomes, while also being able to extend the ball down the field more. That's why you brought in Malachi Fields. That's why you're going to try to do what you're going to do with Jaden Greathouse. That's why you're getting Jeremiah Love more involved in the pass game, is to make that part of the game more dynamic. And I think that then makes the run game more efficient, because the run game was effective, but it wasn't efficient last year. We talked about this in post-game shows and then upon further reviews. There were games where it was hit or miss. I mean, you got to 200 yards because you had a 65-yard run here and a 40-yard run there, and then there was a lot of negatives in between or not great runs in between because of some of the offensive line issues. I think that balances out this year. That part of the game's more efficient too, on top of improvements in the pass game. I think those two things combine to where the ceiling of this football team is certainly that of a top 5 offense, which is, again, that's not a huge jump. You're going from number 9 to number 5 plus. That should be expected from this offense. I don't think that's an unreasonable thing to expect of this offense. I mean, the year before, in the year of Jared Parker, they were 17th in offensive efficiency. And they went from 17 to 9 in year 1 of Mike Denbrock's tenure. There's no reason to think that they can't go. And what were they in 2022? Let me just look this up real quick. They were 41st in 2022. So it went from 41 to 17 to 9. I don't think making a little jump of 4 or more is out of line for what we should expect of this offense.
Yeah, for me, when I look at their ceiling, for me, it's about explosiveness. Because the Notre Dame offense, like you said, is efficient, built on the power game, built on the offensive line, and then making plays to extend drives. And occasionally we would see, Jaden Greathouse make a big play against Penn State. When they got down big against Ohio State, now they're able to make big plays. I want to see that from the beginning. I want to see them be able to come out and not have to use the run game to establish and go ahead and make big plays. Can you make big plays in the passing game without having to come off of the run game? Like, everybody would love to do it that way. But when you face the better defenses in big time games, you're going to have to make plays. You're going to have to open it up. And I don't want to see Notre Dame have to wait until they get into a certain position or they're forced to go their route. I want their offense to be so diverse and efficient that they can choose to do so, whether it's the first quarter, second quarter. And I don't think that takes away from the program being built on the run game. That's going to be the anchor. That's going to be the bell cow. But when you have diversity, I think you're going to love this. That's something that the Denver Broncos were able to do. I think that I remember one of their Super Bowl runs, they had to go up to Pittsburgh and play a game. And John Elway against a Pittsburgh defense that was, Terrell Davis wasn't about to walk up in Three Rivers and just run the ball on that defense with the great linebacker core and the front 7 they had. And they had to make some plays in the passing game starting early. And they were able to do that, jump out in front, and eventually win that game.
And they did it different ways. I mean, Shannon Sharp had the big play late. You had Terrell out of the backfield, Howard Griffith out of the backfield. Hit Rod Smith, Ed McCaffrey. Mm-hmm. Like, they did it different ways. But they lost at Pittsburgh earlier in the season. Yeah. So it's like they knew they couldn't just go out there, like you said, just go run the ball.
So when I say explosive plays, I'm not saying come out, like Andre Ware, Houston Cougars, and just now you're just throwing the ball all over the field. But no, you have to have a sense of fear that you can impose on the defense.
You have to respect it. It has to be respected, or we're going to make you pay for it.
Absolutely.
That's what it comes down to. Respect it, or we're going to make you pay for it.
Especially early in the season where teams are still going to say, prove it to us. I expect teams to still say, prove it to us.
They should.
So, absolutely.
Yeah. We have to remember, too, that one thing that makes the jump a little tougher is we have to consider that last year was a down year for offensive football. That's part of why it was a bit of a down year overall. We talked about it going into the year. This is not as good of a year. This is a bit of a down year in college football. Well, what does that mean? Teams just weren't as dynamic. So what I mean by that, an example of that is last year, there was only 2 teams in college football that averaged over 39 points a game. It was Miami and Indiana. The year before, there were 5 that averaged over 40, and there were 7 that averaged over 39, including Notre Dame, who averaged 39.2 points per game the year before. Well, why did their efficiency numbers go up when their scoring went down? Because they played much tougher competition, which is going to be true in an era where some of the better teams are now playing 2, 3, 4 extra games in the post, at the end of the regular season. So, but it also was a bit of a down year in college football. There was no LSU last year. With all due respect to Miami, who was the best defense in college football last year, offense in college football last year, statistically, they were not nearly as good as the LSU offense in 2023, in my opinion. Just weren't. They were a little bit more effective running the football with their running backs, but they weren't as good as the 2023 LSU offense. And that's part of it too. I think offense is going to be a little bit better this year around the country. And so Notre Dame's going to have to not only raise their level of play compared to what it was last year, but it's also relative to what everybody else does. But I think they're more than capable of it. Defensively, Shaun, here's the interesting one. When you look at the floor of the Notre Dame defense, and statistically, I think it makes a very interesting case, because I would argue that there's a world in which Notre Dame could be better defensively this year. And I'm not talking about a Chris Ash thing. I'm just saying in theory, even if Al Golden was back, there's a world in which the Notre Dame defense is better than it was last year, or at least as good, but doesn't look as good on paper. Meaning it doesn't look as good points per game. It doesn't look as good yards per game, because they're playing a much tougher schedule. And that's kind of how I feel about last year. I mean, 15.5 points per game. And I keep asking people, like, who were the big-time quarterbacks they faced last year? They, in my opinion, they really only faced one in the regular season. That was Tyler Shuck. And they struggled a little bit early with him and eventually figured it out, and it really overwhelmed their offensive line. But the next best quarterback they faced, in my opinion, the two best quarterbacks they faced other than him were two triple option quarterbacks, and Blake Horvath and Bryson Daly, because you didn't face Haynes King, who was hurt in that game. I mean, Connor Wegman was disappointing last year. Northern Illinois' quarterback was average. Purdue's quarterback struggled because the rest of Hudson Card struggled because the team struggled. Miami's quarterback was a nice MAC quarterback. That's it. Stanford's quarterbacks were not good. Florida State's quarterbacks were not good. Virginia's quarterbacks were awful. And USC's quarterback looked good against Notre Dame, but he wasn't he's not a big-time quarterback, at least wasn't last year. I think the difference this year is I actually do think the quarterback play is way better this year. I mean, just front to back, you're going to get Carson Beck. Marcel Reed is not a guy that I think is a great quarterback, but anytime you have a run-throw guy, he can hurt you if you're not disciplined, if you don't play well. I think Ryan Brown is a good, talented quarterback at Purdue. Talon Green at Arkansas. You've got Michael Madsen at Boise State. I'm going to eventually get that. You've got one of my favorite quarterbacks coming back in all college football, C.J. Bailey. Shaun, how many times do you guys hear me talk about C.J. Bailey? I freaking love C.J. Bailey. You've got Jalen Maiava is going into year 2 there. Potentially Dylan Lonergan at BC, if he's able to win that job as a former big-time quarterback that transferred from Alabama. You've got Eli Holstein. You've got either Ricky Collins or Steve Angeli at quarterback for Syracuse. And then you're probably going to have Elijah Brown at Stanford, who used to be the modern-day quarterback. I think quarterback play is much improved. There's some good receiving cores they're going against. The only issue for opponents is outside of A&M and Miami, there's not a lot of great offensive lines on the board right now. But one thing, so that's where I lead to is the floor is basically just be what you were. Like, that's the floor. But it may not look like it statistically. You could actually give up a point or two more per game, and it's actually more impressive when you consider what they're facing this year, which I believe, and of course, Blake Horvath is also on the schedule. I kind of passed by him because I already mentioned him, but that's there's no team that I look at and I'm like, their quarterback sucks. There were several teams I said that about. There's no Virginia quarterback room on the schedule right now. There's no Stanford quarterback room because I think they're going to finally be playing a better quarterback. I was never a big Ashton Daniels fan. You know that. There's nobody on the schedule. I'm like, that guy's terrible. There were several guys last year that we looked at and said, that guy's not good. Or there's no MAC teams on the schedule this year. And even though those MAC teams played Notre Dame tough, it wasn't because of their quarterbacks last season.
I agree with you, but I'm going to look at it from this standpoint. Barring injury, Notre Dame would be in better position as a defense to win the championship as they head into the playoffs. Forget the numbers. Forget them not living up to the analytics and what they did in 2024. When they get to December this Notre Dame team would be in a better position defensively to go on and win a national championship, meaning they will be better against an Ohio State type offense when it's all said and done. I anchor that on the depth, especially and specifically on the defensive line, that I think is better than last year. And they, without that similar depth, in my opinion, made the run that they made, missing two of their best defensive linemen. I saw Archer say something that I thought was funny. He said the floor was 9-3 from his perspective. And I would love for Archer to think about it. You take Jack Sawyer and JT off that team in the middle of the season, and it tell me whether or not Ohio State still makes it to the national championship game. Take their best two pass rushers off that defense. I'll be very interested in whether or not they make it to the national championship game. So that just goes to show you, I love the way Marcus Freeman has created the culture in this program. It's almost like he eliminates the floor. He eliminates the thought process of like, there is no floor for us. Injuries, whatever happens to us, the standard is the standard. The golden standard is the standard. And so I think with that mindset, what we're going to see, B, I think we will see a step back early on. I think the transition, Chris Ash, playing against better quarterbacks. I do think if you look at the stats, it would be fair for people to say the defense might not be as good.
Statistically, you're saying it's understandable. Yes, agreed.
Yes, I understand that early on. But as the season goes on, I would not be shocked if they equal or start to trend with better numbers than they had in posting in 2024. And of course, that's barring injury.
So what you're saying is the end of the season numbers may not be as good, but they'll be better in the postseason.
I would say if you take the second half of 2025 and compare it to the numbers of 2024, they're probably going to be very comparable, or the 25 defense might even be better as they get acclimated as the season moves on. And the quarterbacks better catch them early in the season. That's my opinion. Sure. The better quarterbacks better catch this Notre Dame defense early in the season, because I feel like as this defense gets more acclimated to Chris Ash and he gets more similar to Denbrock. Denbrock had to come in and figure out certain things as he went through the season, and then you're hitting on
what will determine the floor versus the ceiling.
Yeah,
and that is it's Chris Ash's ability to get the most out of this team.
Mm-hmm.
Look, I think Al Golden's defense last year statistically was better than the one from the year before in most areas. Wouldn't have been if the last year's team would have had to play 4 postseason games, but I think it benefited from it was very talented. It benefited from not playing a very difficult offensive schedule. And like Trev and I talked about last week, and you tell me if you agree with this. I said, look, I don't know that there's any running backs on the board there's not as many outside of maybe Le'Veon Moss. There's not as many high-level running backs this year that they faced like last year when they played Arterio Brown. They also had Le'Veon Moss. They had Jamal Haynes. But the difference is I feel like every team they play has a really good running back to some degree. It's that depth of competition. And I think we've talked about this before. The 2023 schedule had 3 or 4 really good teams and then a bunch of just very mediocre to bad football teams on it. I mean, Pitt was terrible 2 years ago. They were Florida State bad, but then there was other teams like that on the schedule. Navy was way better in 2024 versus 2023. And so I think the defense benefited from playing some really just not good offenses last year. Virginia's quarterback. And I think a lot of that had to do with the offensive lines and the quarterbacks. They're just going to they're going to face a tougher test this year. The good news is that they're going to be extremely talented. And that's why I say that the floor is you've got to repeat your effectiveness of last season, whatever that means statistically. Your ceiling is that you get better on defense. And better means it's kind of like we talked about the opposite of the offense. Great pass defense, but not a great run defense, especially in the postseason. Like they did a great job of shutting Georgia down, but Georgia's rush offense last year was very mediocre all year. Actually, wasn't even mediocre. I think that might actually be kind. I think it was bad. I mean, Indiana finished the year ranked 163rd in rushing offense, and Georgia finished the year ranked 102nd in rushing offense. Those are the two offenses you shut down in the postseason. Penn State, however, ranked 17th in college football in rushing yards last year. Ohio State ranked 58th, but you and I both know that they were a little better than that from an efficiency standpoint. They ranked 29th in yards per carry. The two good rushing offenses you faced in this postseason, you had problems with. And that they were, if you were a passing team, Notre Dame was going to shut you down. If you had any sort of balance and you were a top level team, you were going to give them some problems. And unless they could just overwhelm your offensive line like they did Louisville's. So I think that's the ceiling for me, is they become a much better dual threat defense, that they can rush the quarterback, which they weren't great at last year. They can stop the run, which they weren't great at last year. They weren't terrible. They were good. They just weren't championship caliber, obviously. And then but you don't sacrifice still being outstanding throwing the football to be better in those other areas. Because if Al Washington wanted to, he could have had a top 10 run defense last year. And they would have been, the question is, how big of a hit do they take in the pass game? That's the question.
You know what I'm interested in? Because remember I asked you, teams are going to make Notre Dame prove it still, right? Anticipation that the quarterbacks would be better in the passing game, particularly down the field. Offensive line will be better. But you still feel like teams early on are going to prove it to us. Mm-hmm. We won't believe. We'll adjust. If you burn us, then we'll adjust. Let's flip it on the defensive side. To whereas now teams are saying what you just pointed out. They're looking at the schedule, but the teams that did have a quarterback, did have some players at wide receiver and running back, they were able to make plays. Look at the national championship game. So now teams come in saying, okay, this is how, but now I'm very interested, because do they still say we'll still approach it like that, even though Chris Ash is the defensive coordinator, or do we go watch Chris Ash's defense to try to find some of the weaknesses and how we go at? Because I can say, I feel like just from a personnel standpoint, my anticipation is Notre Dame's going to be a little bit more solid against the run, particularly on the inside. I don't know if they're going to have.
Yeah, I mean, they should.
They should.
But that's what you and I think, because we cover it every day. It's like this. Who are you going to try to go at? Who are you going to game plan to beat? Gabriel Rubio and Boubacar and Josh Burnham and Bryce Young and Donovan Heinisch and Jason Onye? Mm-hmm. Or are you going to try to say we're going to build our game plan around beating Notre Dame around going after Leonard Moore and Christian Gray and Devontae Smith and Don Schuler? That's my point.
Yeah, and Carson Hobbs.
You got to make Notre Dame struggled to stop the run in some of the games that they didn't play as well in, and including Louisville. Like, if they didn't jump on Louisville early and didn't take Louisville out of their game, Louisville had a couple gash runs on Notre Dame early. And I still say, what would that USC game of Notre Dame still would have won, but what it would have looked like if Woody Marks was not injured, like in the first quarter of the game, So those are things I look at and say, it's all about the run game for early opponents. We're gonna shut down Notre Dame's run game. We're gonna see if they can stop the run, and maybe try to force their safeties to get down in the box, because then maybe we can set up some one-on-one opportunities, up the seam or even on the outside. So I think that's going to be the key. It's going to, and the first two opponents are good enough to do that if you're not improved. But when I look at Notre Dame last year, what did Penn State do to beat Notre Dame? What did Ohio State do? See, you talk about the pass game, and yes, they did some things. They had a couple big throws in the pass game. But a lot of what Ohio State did to beat Notre Dame was running the football. They only passed for 231 yards. And how many of that came on the last play on the last drive? They beat Notre Dame because they were gashing Notre Dame on the ground. And it's one thing to say, I'm going to make you beat me running the football. It's another thing to say, we're going to just give up gash plays. And that's what they did to Notre Dame, is it was the gash plays that they had on 214 yards rushing, 5.2 per carry. Think about it. Your last two games of the season last year, you gave up over 200 yards per game rushing. In your last 6 games last year, so that includes Army, USC, Indiana, Georgia, Penn State, and Ohio State, You gave up over 200 yards 3 times. One of those you could say is a good performance against Army. But then the other one, let's just say last 5 games. Let's take the triple option team out. You played USC, Indiana, Georgia, Penn State, and Ohio State in those games. And when you look at it, you had USC ranked 21st in rushing off yards per play. You had Penn State ranked 17th in yards per rush. Ohio State ranked 29th in yards per rush. Those are the 3 good teams that were in the top 50 in rushing offense and yards per play. And Georgia ranked 84th in rushing yards per play. And then Indiana ranked 68th in rushing yards per play. How'd they do? They held Indiana to 63 yards rushing on 2.3 per carry. They gave up 62 yards rushing to Georgia on 2.1 per carry. The 3 teams ranked in the top 30 in yards per play. They gave up 197 to USC, 7.0 yards per carry. They gave up 204 to Penn State, 4.9 yards per carry. And they gave up 214 to Ohio State, 5.2 yards per carry. If I'm a good team and I'm playing Notre Dame, I'm going to make them stop me from running the football. I'm going to see if Chris Ash can do a better job of this. And if you're Texas A&M in your game plan, you're thinking, when we tried to throw the ball early, Notre Dame killed us. When did we start having success in the second half? It's when we started leaning on them with our big offensive line. And then they went away from that, and then Notre Dame, obviously forced them to go away from that to a degree. But that's what when I look at this team, I say that's my secret is if I can run the football on you, that's how we're going to have success. Now, will Chris Ash be able to improve that? I don't know, but that's the key to the ceiling. That's the key to this becoming a team that can win a championship because of the defense. The defense got you there, but it wasn't good enough in that big moment. We've always said defense can get you to the show, but your offense is going to have to be the one to win it. And that's still true. Why? Because when you play teams like Ohio State, it's going to be hard to do to them like what you did to Georgia and Indiana. Yeah. Georgia being this version of Georgia, not 2-3 years. It'd be a whole different. If you'd have played Georgia with Brock Bowers and Ladd McConkey and A.D. Mitchell and Stetson Bennett, it would have looked a lot like the championship game this year as opposed to what they actually did to Georgia this year. And you put Carson Beck in there too, it would have been the same story, if not worse, because I think they'd have forced him into 2-3 turnovers, in my opinion. But that's my point, Shaun, is your defense is gonna struggle to dominate in the postseason unless you're a truly elite defense. But that's the ceiling. Because I think at the end of the day, right now, I don't believe that the defense can carry this team yet if I'm an opponent. But I believe as a Notre Dame person, breaking down the film, knowing this roster the way I do, it has the potential to be that at some point in time next season. The question is going to be how close do they get to reaching their full potential? I think the linebacker is going to be elite. How good are the D tackles? That's a question. How good are the edge players? That's a legitimate question. And so until we see that, because again, you don't have Riley Mills, but we didn't have Riley Mills last year. Yeah, exactly. And look what happened in the last 2 games when you didn't have Riley Mills and a healthy Howard Cross. You got ran on. Now, part of that scheme, but that's the question. Can they be an elite, like 21 Georgia, thinking of the 2015 Bama, like can they be one of those type of teams, 2018 Clemson? Can they be one of those type of defenses? I don't know. That's the ceiling, but there's more room. I'll say this is going to sound crazy. I'm more confident that the offense reaches its ceiling than I am the defense. And a lot of that simply boils down to we know more about what's up front on the offensive line, and we know the coordinator. That's where it really comes from for me.
That's fair.
We may have a different conversation a year ago, but it's hard for me. I could switch hats and put my Homer hat on. I got it over there, my Notre Dame Homer hat, and I could say, well, it's this and the town. That's all great, but there's a lot of you got to show me. You got to prove it on defense. There's way more proven aspects to the offense in the front, running back, wide receiver, than there is on defense. On offense, the only unproven position is really quarterback and tight end. That's it. Everywhere else is proven to some degree, to some large degree. Defensively, I don't think it's as proven in some key areas. But bigger picture, it's just I don't know what Chris Ash is going to do with this defense. So it's not good, it's not bad, it's just the unknown. And I think that's why I'm more not that the offense has a higher ceiling than the defense. It's just I'm more confident the offense is going to reach their ceiling because it's just more of a known commodity. And that's why I say you could argue that a lot of the success this season and your ceiling floor as a team is going to rely on the ability of Chris Ash to get the most out of this defense. Because if he can, the defense on the talent on defense is, in my opinion, it's elite. But it's just like Emil Wagner doesn't as far go. Jagasol, Wagner, Schrouth, Knapp, Greathouse, Faison, Fields, Pauling, Love, Price. They don't have as far to go to reach their elite potential as Jordan Patelho and Boubacar and Bryce Young and Josh Burnham and Jason Onye and some of those guys, Jadon Blair and Luke Talich and Bronte Johnson, as they do. That's a much greater, here's where they are, here's where they can get to, where those other guys have already kind of gone along those lines. A lot of it because of injury and youth, but that's the reality. The potential on defense is elite. Boubacar and Bryce Young could be elite. Josh Burnham on the edge, Junior, Patelho. That could be Logan Thomas. That could be the best end rotation in the country. The D tackles could be outstanding. Elite, I don't know about that, but outstanding. The linebackers can be elite. The corners can be elite as a duo. The safeties can be elite, and as the secondary as a whole can be elite. But I need Christian Gray to take a step. I need Adon to take a step. I need Devontae to prove he can play a full year. I need whoever the other safety is. I mean, there's a lot of question marks there. More so, I have more questions about this defense than I have the offense, which is kind of surprising. But it's just because of the known commodity aspect. But also, I know Mike Denbrock. I know what he can do at Notre Dame. Chris Ash now has to prove it. We'll have a different conversation a year from now. But that's, being objective, that's why I still have a little bit of a we have to see aspect on offense.
Interesting way of looking at this. Which unit's floor and them playing at that floor level would have a greater effect on the other unit? Meaning that if the offense is playing at its floor during the season, will it have a greater effect on the defense's ability to reach its ceiling than vice versa?
I think the defense playing at their floor will still have a good impact on the offense. Or if the offense plays at their floor, and it really comes down to the postseason for me, Shaun. It's the offense playing at their peak does more for the defense than the defense playing at their peak does for the offense. I think it takes so much pressure off the defense to just say, hey, we can just go back, pin our ears back, and make some plays. That's kind of how I look at it. So what's your answer to that?
I think I would agree with your assessment, but I was interested in hearing it because I just think this defense, you pointed out Chris Ash, and I'll put my Homer hat on for a second. Even though Al Golden and Chris Ash are the defensive coordinators, I just feel like it's Marcus Freeman's defense. I'm always going to have that in the back of my head. I'm always going to feel like Marcus Freeman, when he needs to walk in the room and say, hey, clean this up. I know this might have been the direction that we were going, but we need to get back to doing this. I just have faith and belief that he'll do that because I feel like he's done that across the board in his program. So I have a little bit more faith. I'm not as worried as some people, which is fair to be worried about the transition from Al Golden to Chris Ash. And I'll put some weight in what the player said during the spring, which is pretty much nothing has really changed that much. I mean, he didn't come in here and try to reinvent the wheel, but there are nuances of, in-game adjustments.
Exactly.
Timing of calls,
and Al Golden was a
things.
master in-game.
Yes. And, Al Golden would go up against, I'll say this, did Al Golden go up against better offensive minds in comparison to the offensive coordinators that Chris Ash is going to go up against? Because I think what you saw in that Louisville game and other games where he went up against really good play callers, he had this ability to just make people play left-handed, if you want to say. Like, we're not going to let you do what you want to do. So you're just going to have to prove, like we asked about other teams and how they view Notre Dame. You're going to have to prove to us that you can beat us this way. Does Chris Ash have that mentality? Or is he going to be stubborn and say, this is the way I want to do it, and have to learn, to do things a little bit different? That's going to be interesting. So I understand the nuance of
Yeah.
what you're saying. But
I think
for me, I look at it with young quarterbacks. If you have a defense playing at that level, a ceiling level early on, it makes you comfortable as well. Because you talked
sure
about the
early on,
offense
yeah.
making the defense,
Yeah.
being able to pin their ears back. I'm just looking at it from the standpoint, young quarterbacks.
I just don't care as much about early in the season as a lot of people do, and I get it. It's the most. I care more about the postseason because I think that's where Notre Dame is now. It's like you're not building to beat Miami and Texas A&M per se. You have to beat them to get to that stage, but like you're building now to beat Georgia and Ohio State and Penn State and Texas and Oregon. That's what Clemson. That's what you have to be building for. Now, eventually, Miami and Texas A&M could get to the point where you have to build to beat them too, but they're not there right now. You're a better program than they are. I also am not someone who is like, I don't think the offense can reach its floor because of a first-year quarterback. I think number one, we see way too many people putting first-year quarterback onto people. Arizona State last year went to the college football playoffs with a first-year quarterback. And so you're telling me that CJ Carr can't do what Sam Leavitt did? Well, why was Sam Leavitt able to do that? Because they didn't ask Sam Leavitt to play like a star in his first year as a starting quarterback. That's the whole point. If CJ Carr was going into the season with if CJ Carr was going into the year with what Notre Dame had last year on offense, meaning 6 combined starts on the offensive line, a true freshman at left tackle, a redshirt freshman at left guard, first-year starter at right tackle, and solid but not unproven at the guys haven't proven a big level at receiver. I would be much more concerned about his ability to lead the team. But the thing about this team is they don't need him to be Riley Leonard this year. It's a different team. CJ Carr is going to have a much better supporting cast, which is why you and I have talked about before. If Riley Leonard was coming back in year 2, he'd have. And you also have to think this is CJ Carr's second year in the Mike Denbrock offense. Last year, really, fall camp was the first time Riley Leonard was really taking real snaps in Mike Denbrock's offense. And so it's just a different story. But last year, Riley needed to carry that team to a degree. You don't need CJ to do that this year. And that's when you look at Arizona State, that's the point that I'm making is they didn't ask Sam Leavitt to come out and light the world on fire to start the season. I mean, they beat Mississippi State. He passed for 69 yards, and then he starts getting into playing some bad teams, Texas Tech, Texas State don't have good defenses, but they beat Kansas. He threw for 157 yards. They beat Utah. He threw for 154. They beat a 3-9 Oklahoma State team. He rips them up, but then they go play UCF. He throws for 161. It wasn't until November that he played against a good team and had to throw for a bunch of yards, and that was against Kansas State. Well, now you're in, start 8, 9, 10, things like that. That's the point is CJ going to have to make some throws for them to win their first 2 games? Of course. Is he going to have to look like 2019 Joe Burrow? No, he doesn't. And that's the whole point is they don't need CJ to play at a high level to reach their floor. They just need him not to suck to reach their floor. They need CJ to play at a high level to reach their ceiling. That's the difference. And I think that comes down to what's your evaluation of CJ Carr. If you think CJ Carr is just a solid top 250 quarterback, then your feeling is going to be different. If you think, CJ Carr is what I think he is, a 5-star talent, then you're going to, and that's fair. That's totally fair. There's not a right or wrong answer to there. It's all opinion until we see CJ play. But that factors into why some people are going to not be as high because first-year starter, not all that talented, solid talent, but not elite talent. I'm going to be more nervous than, he's a first-year starter, but he's an elite talent. And we've seen those type of guys have a lot of success. I mean, Jameis Winston in 2013 won a title, and CJ Carr took more reps as a freshman than Jameis Winston did because, remember, they couldn't play back then. Freshmen couldn't play back then. You talk about Jalen Hurts as a true freshman at Alabama, went to the title game. So we saw Trevor Lawrence as a true freshman win a title at Clemson. So I just say, if you think CJ's not on that level or anywhere close to that level, then you're going to be more concerned. I think CJ is not. I don't think he's Trevor Lawrence, but I think CJ Carr is an elite talent. And so I think that's going to factor into it. But Mike Denbrock's not going to ask him to go be elite. And I've pointed this out before. Mike Denbrock's had plenty of success with first-year redshirt freshman starting quarterbacks. They went from 3-9 to 11-2 with Desmond Reed as a redshirt. The year before Desmond takes over, what was Cincinnati's record in 2017? It was, let's see here, it was last year of Hayden Moss. They went 4-8. And then first year of Desmond Ridder, they scored 20.9 points a game. That was Mike Denbrock's first year at Cincinnati. His second year at Cincinnati, he takes over. He goes into the year, and they start Desmond Ridder as a redshirt freshman. It went from 20.9 points a game to 34.9 points a game, and went 11-2. And then, of course, we know what he did at Notre Dame in 2015 with really two first-year starting quarterbacks. Although obviously DeShone Kaiser's the more relevant example because he played longer and he was a redshirt freshman. And I would argue that CJ Carr is a more advanced and further along than what DeShone Kaiser was. And that Notre Dame team went out there that year and played in the Fiesta Bowl and set a program record in yards per play with a redshirt freshman quarterback. So this isn't new for Mike Denbrock. And we've seen him be successful in those situations. And so, but I would also argue that part of what helped Desmond Ridder was he had a pretty good supporting cast around him. What helped DeShone Kaiser in 2015 is he had a pretty good supporting cast around him. Same thing here. He's got a pretty good supporting cast around him. He doesn't need to play like a first-team All-American for them to reach their floor. The better he plays is the closer they get to their ceiling. So that's why I believe I said the team I'm most confident in reaching their floor is the offense. And that's why. So I'm not ignoring that they've got a first-year starting quarterback. If they didn't have a first-year starting quarterback, the floor would be much higher. I expect them to the floor would be the ceiling if CJ was going into year, like if we were getting 2026 version of CJ Carr, because again, that's who I expect to be the starter. And if he's not the starter, it doesn't change anything because Kenny's going to have to beat him out to be the starter, which means Kenny's going to play at a high level also. But if we were getting like next year's version of it, now my floor would be the ceiling, and my ceiling would be they should be the best. They could be the best offense in college football. I truly believe. I mean, it's not just my opinion. Athlon Sports thinks they have the number 2 running back room in the country, the number 1 offensive line in the country. There's 2 other outlets that believe that Notre Dame has a top 10 receiving core. Lindy Sports, who doesn't think they have a top 10 receiving core, ranked Jaden Greathouse as the 9th best receiver in college football, and Malachi Fields is the 17th best receiver in football. So this isn't just Brian Driscoll being a Notre Dame homer saying that. You can make that case with what other people outside of the Notre Dame sphere are saying about this team as well. And that's why I say that CJ doesn't have to be that guy. We're not making the case for the receiving core and the O-line going into last year because we had no clue what the offensive line was going to look like last year. That's the difference.